Hello again, Matt back with you with the latest examination question. So this one appeared in an Ostro exam, January 24. It's quite a long one, as a lot of these HPL questions are sometimes, especially these days because everything has to be put into a scenario first. So a long question, also some quite long and detailed answers. It'll take a little while to go through them. Actually, some people might be a little upset or indignant because it seems to be talking about something that might be, well, more related to RNAV perhaps. So it's talking about FMSs and LNAV and VNAV, but it is actually an HPL question because really all we're talking about here is the use of automated systems. Now with a question like this, no matter how wordy it is, the main thing is to go back to the basics. Think, what is the question about? Try and get in the head of the examiner. Well, it's about situational awareness. And one of the factors, of course, when it comes to situational awareness is the effect that us using automation has on that, which is quite often negative. But more specifically, this question is about the dangers associated with blinkered concentration. So concentrating on something in particular to the expense of other items or other issues within the cockpit. Okay, so let's read it through. So an aircraft operating with the FMS in the LNAV VNAV mode is operating in a busy terminal area. That's an important phrase at the end of a flight. Also, we've got bad weather. So bad weather in the area has resulted in ATC requiring the flight crew to make several changes to the aircraft's flight path. And the question is, what is the best action for the pilots to take in order to maintain the maximum awareness of their flight status? Okay, so the first answer says the FMS in LNAV VNAV mode is the primary and the most accurate navigation system available to the pilots, and its use should be maintained. That seems like a fair enough statement in a way. In order to minimize data entry errors, both pilots should check the entry of the new LNAV VNAV parameters at the same time. That also sounds sensible, doesn't it? The next answer is, in order to mitigate against data loss of situational awareness, peculiar phrase that, and avoid the risk of errors while entering new data, the FMS should be switched off, and the pilot should respond to ATC instructions by flying the aircraft manually. Okay, that one sounds a little dubious, doesn't it? Charlie, reprogramming of the FMS in the LNAV VNAV mode during periods of high workload can lead to errors and also cause a loss of situational awareness. Therefore, the pilot should downgrade to a lower and a simpler level of automation, such as altitude heading hold, or even to manual flying. So that's the second time now they've mentioned the possibility of flying manually. And lastly, the main risk is that the pilots become distracted while reprogramming the FMS. Well, that's true. To reduce this risk, the pilot in command should immediately request a short delay or a hold in order to complete the entry of the new LNAV VNAV parameters before continuing with the approach. Okay, so very wordy. Some of it sounds feasible, some of it sounds a bit strange, but we really need to think about it quite deeply to come up with the right answer. But going back to this aspect of concentrating on one thing to the detriment of everything else, a good example, of course, is a particular accident, the United Airlines Flight 173. Now that accident was credited with highlighting the need for CRM training in the first place. And if you remember, the captain allowed the aircraft to run out of fuel. They were circling over Portland in Oregon. They were basically investigating the fact that the landing gear had made an unusual noise, and they were trying to work out whether it had actually been lowered or not. Everybody was concentrating on that, and the aircraft ran out of fuel. So that seems to be what they're talking about here. Anyway, going back to situational awareness. Let's have a little recap on that. So you may have had this experience before. When you start to lose situational awareness, it's almost as if you're disconnecting from the aircraft, from the flight. So we can define situational awareness as if we like, an accurate perception of the operational and environmental factors that are affecting the flight. Also, what we need to do is maintain the big picture. Also, this is a phrase that appears in examination questions from time to time, a mental map. So firstly, we want to create a mental map of what's going on around us, but then also regularly update it. So we should also gather as much information as possible from a variety of sources. Take time to make a decision. Consider all possible interpretations of the information that we are gathering. And like we just said, maintain a running three-dimensional mental plot of where the aircraft is and where it's going. Also, it helps, if possible, to mentally step back from the situation occasionally to think about the hows and the whys. Okay, now there are also some practical measures you can do to retain situational awareness. So, trim the aircraft properly, engage the autopilot, integrate all the sources of information you have at your disposal to build up that accurate picture, and also importantly, give yourself time to think and assess. And if you come up with a hypothesis, just test it against some known facts and also any new facts that are coming in. So a breakdown in situational awareness will lead to these three things, which also appear in exam questions, what they call a false hypothesis, and therefore inappropriate actions, and then you get that feeling of being behind the aircraft, what we also refer to sometimes as behind the drag curve, and I'm sure we've all experienced that from time to time. Okay, so that's what situational awareness is all about. Bit of a recap. So back to this question then, and looking at each of those answers in a little bit more detail. So that first sentence, well, there is some truth in it. The FMS is a very important resource, but the question is, do we actually want to be reprogramming it now? Because it said we're in a busy area, we're in bad weather. Of course, in the normal course of things, in a low workload environment, yes, the pilot should check the entry of the new parameters, but again, we don't want either of them to be tied up with that in a high workload environment. This is beginning to sound like a sort of modern version of that United Airlines Flight 173 that I just mentioned. The next answer, so bravo now. Largely nonsense, really, isn't it? And I think you can recognize it as that quite quickly because of the first phrase. In order to mitigate against data loss of situational awareness. It just sounds clumsy, doesn't it? Also, a bit further on it says, and the pilots should respond to ATC instructions by flying the aircraft manually. Remember, with HPL questions, we should always be a bit wary of overly prescriptive answers. So when we see the word like should, we should just be a bit wary of that. Moving on to Charlie now, though. So the first statement does sound sensible, doesn't it? Reprogramming of the FMS during periods of high workload can lead to errors and also cause a loss of situational awareness. Yeah, okay. Then it goes on to say the pilot should downgrade to a lower, simpler level of automation, such as altitude heading hold, or even to manual flying. Okay, there is a lot to be said when things are getting a bit difficult and you're starting to feel you're behind the aircraft and you have an autopilot. There's a lot to be said for slapping on that altitude hold and that heading hold. Let them take charge of the aircraft for the moment while you sort out the problem, while you take a deep breath and regain situational awareness. Now, it also mentions there even to manual flying. Now, often the advice in a situation of high workload is to use the autopilot and to resist manual flying. And that's very true in a single pilot situation. But here we do have two pilots. So manual flying does seem like a reasonably good idea. In fact, there's nothing that concentrates the mind more than actually disengaging the autopilot in the first place. So that question sounds spot on, doesn't it? It's talking about the things that can cause situational awareness. It's coming up with a solution to it, which sounds eminently sensible. Anyway, let's just check the last answer just to make sure. And that says the main risk is that the pilots become distracted while reprogramming the FMS. Well, yes, we've already decided that's true. To reduce the risk, the pilot command should request a short delay or a hold. Well, yeah, we're not going to do that in a practical situation, are we? I can just imagine the response from air traffic control if you asked for that. So we can discount that answer as well. So reading through them, thinking about what's actually behind this question, what would be a sensible course of action, that leads us to answer Charlie. But an interesting one, I'm sure you'll agree. Anyway, see you at the next question.